Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku Accidentally Became Eraserhead? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. When Izuku realized he was starting to get close to the hero fight, he turned on his heel and started walking in the opposite direction. He'd already gotten in All Might's way today and made him run out of time, so the last thing he wanted was to cause trouble for more heroes. Of course, a nuisance was all he'd ever be. Like All Might had said, he would never be able to be a true hero, which meant that all he'd ever be to the heroes was just another civilian to be saved. Who knew, maybe Kaken would save him someday. Izuku smiled sadly at the thought. At least Kaken would still make an excellent hero, and he might not be happy about having to save a worthless Deku like him, but he would, even if just to prove that he was stronger than whatever villain was attacking them. Izuku tripped over a crack in the sidewalk and went sprawling to the concrete. Ta-da! There were no heroes around to save him from a scraped knee, not that it'd be worth their time if they were around, so Izuku dug through in his backpack until he found his first aid kit. Ow, ow, ow. Izuku hissed when the alcohol wipe tugged against his skin, and in his rush he was probably a little rougher than he should have been, but he was used to the pain of taking care of his own injuries. He grimaced as he stood up, but now that the wound was clean, the pain was back down to an ignorable level. He took a few steps before stopping when he realized he had no idea where he was. Izuku sighed and grabbed his phone. Thankfully there were apps for that. As soon as he got past the lock screen, an update notification took up the entire screen, but Izuku didn't have time for that right now, so he didn't even read the notification before tapping the arrow to click past it. At least, that's what he thought the arrow meant before the screen flashed black and a progress wheel popped up. Updating. 0%. Izuku stared at the screen for a long moment before shoving the phone in his pocket. Of course, a useless Deku like him wouldn't even be competent enough to use his own phone. He nervously gripped the straps of his backpack a little tighter and started walking in a random direction. He could find his own way home. He'd done it before when Kaken and his lackeys had chased him to an unfamiliar part of town a few times. Of course, he usually at least had a working phone, but it wasn't the end of the world. He'd done hard things before, like asking All Might himself if he could be a hero. Okay, maybe that wasn't the best example. Izuku heard a loud bang close by and jumped. Okay, Izuku. He muttered to himself. It's just a cat. Or a villain, but probably a cat. Think positive. Izuku gulped in an attempt to swallow his nerves and kept moving. He just had to wander around until he recognized something. Simple enough. He could do this, He jumped again as he heard a shout, "Hey! Get away from there, it'll bite you." Nah, I don't think it's a snake. Another voice said. Not in the middle of the city. Like this. I dunno, maybe it's someone's pet that escaped. Izuku peeked around the corner to see two thugs bent over something he couldn't quite see. One of them was poking at it with a stick, and as Izuku watched, the thing on the ground jumped up and wrapped around the stick before flailing around like a hose with too much water going through it. Both of the thugs yelped, and the one holding the stick threw it down the road toward Izuku before running in the opposite direction, his companion hot on his heels. The stick slammed loudly against the ground as the mysterious snake thing flopped around for what seemed like forever before coming to a stop just a few meters away from where Izuku was hiding. He couldn't make out many details, but from what he could see, it definitely didn't look like a snake. It was longer, for one, and had a weird texture, almost like it was made of fabric? Before Izuku could think better of it, he was already inching forward to take a closer look. The object was a weird shade of gray, and upon further inspection was made of some sort of coarse fabric, so it couldn't be alive, despite the way it had moved before. It was probably an object designed to be reactive, because it had only started flailing around after that guy had poked it with the stick. Izuku's curiosity got the better of him, and he grabbed the stick, which the mystery object was still tightly coiled around, and gave it a little shake. Instantly, the long strip of fabric started flailing like before, only this time, it had more to grab onto. Within seconds, Izuku was tripping over his own 2 feet as his ankles were tied together, and for the second time that night, he went sprawling to the ground. Izuku tugged at the fabric, which obviously had some metallic component that hadn't been obvious before, and got himself a little more tangled. The movement of the fabric seemed familiar, like he'd seen it on a video somewhere, but Izuku couldn't quite worry about that right now when he was helplessly and hopelessly tangled up in a mysterious fabric snake in an unfamiliar part of town. The more he moved, the tighter the stupid fabric became and the more panicked Izuku got. After a few minutes he was so hopelessly trapped that even though his phone was probably done updating by now, he couldn't even reach into his pocket to get it and call for help, so there he was, sitting in the middle of the sidewalk and probably would be until someone found him. No wonder Kaken called him useless all the time. Izuku had no idea how long he sat there, but the sky was dark by the time he calmed down enough to think of doing anything besides uselessly tug at the mystery object. He had to think about this logically. He recognized the movement from somewhere, so maybe if he could remember where he knew it from, that might help him figure out how to get out. Izuku racked his brain for a few minutes. He knew he'd seen it on a video, and most of the videos that he watched were about heroes, so maybe he'd seen a hero use something similar? It could be Best Jeanist, but he normally worked with threads, not whole strips of fabric. There were a couple of minor heroes who had fabric or metal-based quirks, but they didn't use any weapons like this, and the only other person who used something similar was an underground hero that he'd only been able to find, like, 3 videos of, who also carried a knife to cut the weapon with in case it got tangled on something. Izuku gasped and started fanboying as he finally realized what he was tangled in. He'd found a part of Eraserhead's capture scarf. Eraserhead's, oh my, Izuku hardly even realized he was muttering again. He's so cool and he can cancel quirks just by looking at someone and this is his weapon and oh my god, this is so cool. After a few minutes of completely justified freaking out, Izuku took a deep breath and refocused on freeing himself. He never had found very many videos on Eraserhead, but he'd seen enough to recognize the capture weapon, so that meant he'd hopefully seen enough to know how to use it. The biggest thing was that he had to remain calm. The scarf would react to the slightest touch. The stick incident had proved that, so Izuku just needed to keep his movements subtle. He slowly pulled one arm away from his body, smiling when the capture scarf reacted and loosened slightly in response. Izuku got lost in the complexity of how it moved as he tested the scarf's limits and started to learn how it moved. He didn't know how long he spent untangling himself, but eventually he had a carefully coiled scarf stuffed into his bag and more scrapes and bruises than he really wanted to explain. This was the best hero merch he'd ever gotten his hands on. Of course, he knew it wasn't technically merch, but it was still a collectible, and how many kids could say that they had a piece of Eraserhead scarf? Not that he'd be telling anyone, of course. Eraserhead was underground and he didn't want to do anything to endanger the hero's privacy, but it was probably better than his limited edition All Might figurine. That felt blasphemous, but it was true. Eraserhead's scarf was 100% the coolest thing he owned now. Now that he was free and his phone was finally finished updating, Izuku could actually use his Maps app to find his way home. Thanks to him stupidly clinging onto All Might as he jumped, he was a lot farther from home than he wanted to be, so it was going to take a while to get there. If only he could actually use the capture weapon like Eraserhead could. According to a rumor that Izuku had read online, Eraserhead used his weapon to help him parkour across the city when fighting villains, but that took a lot of training that Izuku didn't have. From how hopelessly he'd gotten tangled in the weapon immediately after finding it, it probably took years of practice, especially if Izuku wanted to master it. He stopped in his tracks. Where had that thought come from? Izuku forced himself to take a step forward, and then another one until he was walking again. It wasn't that crazy of an idea. Sure, he couldn't use it to be a hero or anything, but people were allowed to have hobbies. Tons of kids took up wrestling or archery, even though most of those wouldn't ever use those skills to be heroes someday. There was no reason he couldn't at least practice with the weapon. It was just a hobby. Izuku arrived home dirty, exhausted, and to a crying mother. Izuku, honey, where have you been? What did you do to your clothes? You're all dirty. Mom pulled him into a hug so tight that Izuku was almost suffocated for the second time that day. I've been so worried about you. Katsuki was caught up in a villain attack and, oh, he's okay, don't panic, but I thought that the villain might have gotten you too, and so I panicked, and oh, I'm just so glad you're all right. No villain attacks here. Izuku lied. I just took a few wrong turns and got lost. Fell down a couple times. I'm sorry for getting dirt on my uniform. Oh, clumsy boy. Mom tooted. And you're sure you're okay? Izuku nodded. Nothing a shower and a couple band-aids won't fix. He doubted a few band-aids would be enough to fix his broken dream, but Mom didn't need to know about that. He'd already worried her enough. After a quick shower, Izuku hurried to his room and pulled Eraserhead's capture weapon from where it was stashed at the bottom of his bag. It was still just as cool as it had been in the alley, probably even a little cooler since he had enough light to see it properly now. He was right that it had some sort of metal component, but it seemed to be internal, and the weaving of the fabric seemed a lot more intricate in the proper light. He grabbed one end and flung the capture weapon at his bed. The way it moved was fluid, and it wrapped around the poster frame of the bed with ease. Izuku gave an experimental tug, which made the weapon stiffen like it was a slap bracelet and a finger trap all rolled into one really awesome tool. Izuku spent the rest of the night experimenting with his new hero merch, and by the time the sun had come up, he'd managed to almost pull his pillow all the way to him. It wasn't much progress, but Izuku wasn't worried about it. After all, it was just a hobby. I think a piece of your capture scarf spooked some thugs the other day, Takachi said conversationally. They called animal control about this strange fabric snake that tried to eat them. Certainly felt that way before I knew how to use it. Aizawa said wryly, downing the rest of his drink. See you next time. Sure thing. Tsukachi smiled. And Eraser? Please remember to turn in your paperwork on time. I'll do that when it proves itself a logical priority. Aizawa countered, snuggling deeper into his sculpture scarf. Good night. Izuku tried not to make a habit of going to abandoned alleyways, but he needed some place private-ish to practice his new hobby, and his room just wasn't big enough, unless of course he wanted to risk trashing it, and he wasn't willing to endanger his All Might figurines any more than he already had. He'd set up a couple empty cans at one end of the alley and was trying to grab them one by one without crushing them, which was a lot harder than he'd expected. Eraserhead really was an amazing hero to be able to master this weapon with such precision. He hadn't realized how long he'd been practicing until it started to get dark. He looked down at himself and realized he'd never even gone home to change after school and was still in his black middle school uniform. Mom was going to drown him in tears if he didn't get home soon. He wrapped the capture scarf around his neck and hurried through the maze of alleys in an attempt to get home a little faster. He was about halfway through when he stumbled upon a mugging in progress. It was then that he realized an important downside of practicing his new hobby for too long. Instead of hiding or running away like he should have done, his body moved on its own, and muscle memory had him lashing out at the mugger's wrist like it was one of the cans he'd been practicing with earlier. Izuku panicked as the weapon wrapped itself tightly around the mugger's wrist, and without thinking, he pulled as hard as he could, forgetting that that was not the way to loosen the weapon. The mugger wasn't expecting to be pulled, so didn't brace himself enough and ended up falling off his feet. Izuku panicked even more and tried to shake the weapon loose, but instead, the weapon magnified the movement and slammed the poor mugger against the alley wall. He fell limply to the ground, and Izuku finally got enough brain power online to remember how to actually loosen the capture scarf. He glanced at the victim for half a second before he realized how dark it was, and his brain went offline again. He needed to get home like an hour ago. He wrapped the scarf around his neck again and dashed off without another thought. It wasn't until he was trying to fall asleep that night after hiding the capture weapon in his backpack and reassuring his sobbing mother that he was completely unharmed that he realized he'd just run away from the scene of the crime. Oops. It was going to break Mom's heart when the cops came for him. Izuku just knew it. But he was prepared. He just needed to be very contrite when they showed up, and maybe they'd actually believe that the whole thing had been an accident and let him off without life in prison. Okay, it probably wouldn't be life in prison, but that's how it felt. But he was confused. He'd honestly expected a visit from the police within a day or two of fleeing the scene of the crime like that. Vigilantism was illegal after all, however accidental it might have been, but nobody had come for him. So why? It obviously wasn't because he'd done nothing wrong. He definitely had, so what else could explain the suspicious lack of cops? At his door? Izuku frowned. Maybe they hadn't seen his face or something. But he hadn't been wearing a mask or anything, just the capture scarf and his middle school uniform, which he supposed wasn't very distinctive. It was just plain black. Izuku froze. His middle school uniform was plain black, just like a certain hero's costume. Add to that a very distinctive weapon, and when the thug and witness gave their descriptions to the police, the officer would just assume they were describing Eraserhead. Izuku had accidentally impersonated a pro hero. He was so screwed. It took a few hours for Izuku to stop panicking about the newfound weight of his crimes. It wasn't that he forgave himself that eventually calmed him down. No, it was that he realized that his panic was selfish. It wasn't just him that was going to get in trouble for this. If the cops thought that Eraserhead had taken down that mugger, then Eraserhead would get in trouble for not doing the proper paperwork associated with the takedown. That was about 1,000,000 times worse than Izuku getting in trouble himself. If only there was a way to make sure the paperwork still got done. It wasn't like Izuku didn't know how to fill out the paperwork. He'd spent years obsessively researching everything about hero work, even the less glamorous and more mundane parts of the job, so he'd seen copies of the forms they used and even filled out a few as practice until Kaken had found out what they were and burned them all. Of course, the real pros did them online, so they didn't have to constantly go to the police station to turn them in. Izuku worried all the way until he went to bed, and even afterwards, he spent the better half of the night tossing and turning. If only he had Eraserhead's login information to the online system the heroes used. He could just submit everything as if he were Eraserhead, and then the real hero wouldn't have to get in trouble because of Izuku's mistakes. Izuku sat up straight in bed. All he needed was a way to get Eraserhead's login info. Of course, something like that wouldn't be easy, but it was theoretically possible. Online fraud wouldn't be so common if it wasn't. Not that phishing was a good thing to do, but neither was accidentally impersonating a pro hero. And he wasn't trying to hurt Eraserhead, he was trying to help him. Sure, he'd have to trick him in order to do that, but it was okay because he was doing it to make sure the pro didn't get in trouble for not doing his paperwork. He threw off the covers and practically ran to his computer. Time to get to work. It had been a long night. It seemed like every other street had another robbery in progress for Shoyuta to stop. All he wanted to do now was fall into bed and not get up to 2 to 5 business days, but he'd made a mistake. He'd checked his email before passing out. He let out a groan when he saw an email from the commission reminding him that it was time to change his password. He could have sworn he had another month. But whatever. He'd better just take care of it, otherwise Tsukachi would have his head. He clicked on the link provided in the email and filled out the form. It worked a little differently than he remembered from the last time, but he still had to confirm his old password before entering the new one, and websites were always changing their formats these days. It was easy enough to navigate, so Aizawa honestly didn't care. He clicked submit and passed out onto the bed. Izuku sat back in his chair and blinked at the screen. It worked. He had Eraserhead's password. It hadn't been easy. He'd spent about 3 days getting his fake webpage survey to look as close as possible to the official platform the commission used, and another day analyzing the best time to send the email so Eraserhead would be too tired to look too closely at the differences, but he'd done it. Izuku forced himself to push aside his excitement. He needed to log into the site and actually change Eraserhead's password. The last thing he wanted was for the hero to try to log in only to realize his password hadn't changed. It would be a simple leap of logic from there to the fact that Izuku's little SBMSN form wasn't so official after all. Izuku typed in Eraser's password and held his breath. It felt like the site took forever to load, but after the longest few seconds of Izuku's life, the dashboard loaded and Izuku was in. He resisted the urge to cheer in excitement. Mom needed her sleep, and she'd only worry if she knew he was stealing Hero's passwords. He couldn't tell her why he needed to steal Eraserhead's password, because telling her he'd accidentally gotten in a fight and then fled the scene of the crime would just worry her even more. He took care of resetting the password, then explored the portal until he found the form Eraserhead was supposed to fill out after villain attacks. Izuku filled it out slowly, making sure everything was done exactly by the book. He went over his responses at least 3 times before eventually submitting because he didn't want Eraserhead to get in trouble for having mistakes in his paperwork. Tsukachi did a double take. Did Eraserhead actually fill out his paperwork on time for once? Miracles really did happen. He considered calling up Eraserhead to congratulate him on a job well done, but shook his head after thinking for a moment. Eraser was the kind of stubborn where if he pointed something like this out, Eraser would insist it had been an accident and then never do it again. Better to let sleeping dogs lie and hope this was the start of a glorious new habit. Izuku dragged his feet as he made his way home from school. Kaken had called him useless again, which wasn't anything new. He really shouldn't let it get to him so much, but a part of him always wondered if Kaken was actually right and he didn't have any business being a hero. Izuku stopped that train of thought by trying to remember the victim from a few nights ago. She didn't think. He was useless, right? Even if it had been an accident, he'd taken down that mugger. The capture weapon felt heavy in Izuku's bag. Maybe he should go out again, just to prove Kaken wrong, if only to himself. He was weak, sure, but his new hobby was helping him get stronger every day and it wouldn't hurt to add some extra training against real enemies. No one would even be looking for a vigilante at all if Izuku kept filling out all the proper paperwork. Villains and the police would just assume it was the real Eraserhead that had done the takedown and not look any further. Of course, that meant that Izuku couldn't be sloppy because it would reflect badly on the hero. Izuku nodded in determination. It would be a challenge, but a fun one. Izuku didn't think he cut a very intimidating figure in baggy black sweats, even with the capture weapon wrapped around his neck, but that's what the forums reported that the real Eraserhead wore. He climbed another fire escape, wincing at the ache in his thighs. He didn't have the strength or the skill to leap across rooftops, at least not yet, but the vantage point was valuable, so it left him climbing an obscene amount of stairs. Oh well, the pain would be worth it if he could save even a single person tonight. He took a minute to catch his breath when he reached the roof, scanning the surrounding alleyways as best he could in the darkness. Around the time that his lungs finally stopped screaming at him, a movement caught his eye and he rushed to lean over the edge of the roof, squinting into the darkness. It took him a few seconds to recognize that it was a mugging, but as soon as he did, he rushed back to the fire escape and hurried down it, careful to not make too much noise and clattering as he did so. Bullies went after noise like a bloodhound after a scent, and Izuku had no doubt that villains would be the same way. The fire escape spat him out on the wrong side of the building, so Izuku ran, again as quickly as he could, to the correct side of the building and crouched behind a dumpster for a long moment as he assessed the situation. The victim was currently crouched over, apparently in pain, and clutching the sides of his head like he had a migraine. Was it some sort of headache quirk? That was definitely possible. Quirks that allowed the user to directly impact another person's body weren't rare, even if they weren't the most common, but most of those were healing quirks. The victim groaned, sinking to his knees. Get out of my head. A telepathy quirk. Now those were rare. Izuku's inner fanboy immediately started worrying. A telepathy quirk was so cool. He wondered if it went both ways or just one. Maybe it was, "Come out where I can see you, you muttering freak." Izuku blinked in surprise at the voice in his head, then grimaced. Guess he'd started muttering. And after all that effort not to make noise coming down the fire escape. Obediently, he stepped out from behind the dumpster, raising his hands beside his neck where the mugger could see them, but where he could easily reach his capture weapon should he end up needing it. What are you supposed to be, some sort of hero? Izuku started to shake his head and then remembered that yes, he was supposed to be some sort of hero, Eraserhead to be exact. So instead he just didn't answer. Not answering, huh? Well, I suppose it's easy enough to look for myself. Oh, it looked like the telepathy went both ways. He was going to see Izuku's plans and then tell the police, and Izuku would get kicked out of school and never get to go to U. Izuku's mind flitted from worst-case scenario to worst-case scenario faster than he could even process the thoughts. All he knew was that his anxiety was growing bigger and bigger and bigger. Almost without realizing it, he switched his breathing to go slower, holding it at the apex for an extra second or two. It was then that he realized that the mugger didn't have the same coping skills he'd developed to deal with panic attacks. The mugger was currently hyperventilating. Okay, so I just won't use my quirk on you. The mugger grunted after a few seconds. Whatever, see how you deal with this. He lunged, but his movements were a lot slower than Kaken's, so Izuku had more than enough time to grab the capture weapon from around his neck and tangle it in the man's ankles, his momentum carrying him down to knock his head soundly on the ground. Izuku took advantage of the mugger's disorientation and wrapped his hands up in the capture scarf as well before finishing the job with zip ties. It looked like the victim had already run off, so Izuku was going to have to call it in. His voice, however, would make it very obvious that he wasn't the real Eraserhead. What to do? Well, there was nothing in the policies against texting. Tsukachi rolled his eyes when a text from an unknown number came through. Eraserhead always ended up texting instead of actually calling when he had a criminal for the police to pick up, the misanthrope, so he must have gotten a new number. Would it kill the guy to actually talk to people every once in a while? Of course it would undermine his underground loner status. And yet the guy taught high school. Tsukachi radioed in the capture and turned back to his case file. There had been a rash of convenience store robberies in the area during the past few weeks, all using some sort of water quirk. The guy always managed to slip away before the heroes arrived to stop them. It was incredibly frustrating, but the burglar hadn't hurt anyone yet, so maybe he should refer the case out to the local sidekicks. It would be good practice for them. Izuku thought he was decently good at remaining unnoticed. Who cared about a quirkless kid after all? But now that he was trying to do it intentionally, he was finding out just how much room there was for improvement. It seemed like every time he tried to sneak up on a villain, he'd trip over a rock, or hit against a pole, or breathe too loudly. Even his muttering gave him away. It was as frustrating as it was dangerous. Eraserhead was known, by those who knew of him at least, as a stealth hero. The limited information he could find on hero forums often mentioned Eraserhead's ability to sneak up on a target and take away their quirk before the target even knew they were being stalked. Izuku needed to be at least that stealthy if he wanted to continue his hobby. There were a lot of resources on the art of stealth once Izuku started looking. A quick search turned up dozens of articles on the subject. He absently clicked on an article called Stealth, the Art of Making Silence. To his surprise, it was actually written by a parkour enthusiast. Izuku hummed thoughtfully, "Parkour would be useful," he shook his head. One skill at a time. How often have you stopped simply to listen to the world around you? Indeed, how often have you actually listened to yourself? Dutifully, Izuku thought about it. He hadn't ever really considered just listening to himself, but it was worth a try. He left the webpage open and closed his eyes to hear better. Immediately, he clued into his own breathing, loud in the silence. As soon as he was focusing on it, he was able to breathe a little quieter. Without the loudness of his own breathing distracting him, he was able to make out other sounds: his mom in the kitchen, cars driving by outside, the kids at the playground next door yelling as they played. It was amazing just how much noise there was, even though it was quiet. After a few minutes, Izuku opened his eyes and continued reading. It is important to understand that it is not just being quiet for quiet's sake. It has a purpose. That purpose is to improve and refine your control over your physical abilities. Moving silently means moving with absolute precision as well as with constant awareness of your body. You must be choosing how much noise your footsteps and movements make, not letting mere chance decide. Control over his physical abilities? Huh? He had control over his mental abilities, but Izuku flexed his arm and grimaced. His physical abilities weren't anywhere close to where Eraserhead's must be. If stealth meant absolute precision, then he had a lot of work to do. As with everything, the key is to start small. Try dropping off a bench or a table, but simply try to do it silently. The writer of the article then followed up with some more detail of how exactly to absorb his impact by bending his legs when he landed. Izuku grinned and hurried to grab his shoes and keys, too excited to get started to wait any longer. Within a few minutes, he'd arrived at the playground near his apartment, out of breath, but almost trembling with anticipation. It was hard to hear himself over the sound of children playing, but Izuku tried to focus on his breathing, his steps, any movement that could make noise. He found an empty bench and climbed on top. Time to see where he was. The jump was hardly anything special, not like jumping off a wall or a building like Eraserhead could, but even still, the impact was slightly jarring. Izuku felt the force in a wave from his ankles all the way to his hips, hurting every joint along the way. And the landing was loud enough to be heard even over the playing children. Izuku climbed onto the bench and jumped again, focusing on absorbing the impact like the article had described. It was a little easier this time, but still loud. He took a deep breath for determination. By the time the sun set and all the kids on the playground had gone home, Izuku's landing was almost inaudible. He smiled and went home, footsteps almost silent in the quiet night. Izuku wasn't out looking for crime. At least, not tonight. Tonight was for stealth practice. Mostly, that consisted of jumping on and off of things as quietly as he could. He'd been practicing using the capture weapon for longer jumps, and it really made a difference. He could jump off a wall as tall as he was and not make a sound when he landed as long as he anchored the capture weapon somewhere and held on tight. It was exhausting and monotonous, but it was making a big difference. Izuku finally stopped hearing himself and was able to focus on the environment around him. He'd read somewhere that it was called situational awareness. Basically, he had to pay attention to everything that was happening around him at any time to make sure that he didn't accidentally send a can clattering down the street or bump into a pole. Again, exhausting and monotonous to practice, but Izuku knew it would be worth it in the end. He stopped when he heard something that sounded like a scream. It was muffled, like maybe it was coming from inside a building. Izuku turned around frantically looking for any possible source of the scream. The only place around that even looked inhabited was a grocery store that was probably closing up for the night. Izuku bit his lip for half a second before making a beeline toward the store. The employees probably wouldn't appreciate it if they weren't in danger, but if they were then they'd probably forgive him. The bell above the door rang as Izuku charged inside. So much for stealth. It took him a second to make sense of the scene in front of him. There were only a handful of people there, a few employees and one who Izuku assumed was the robber, but all of the employees were staring in terror at one employee who had a circle of water completely encompassing her head like a motorcycle helmet, struggling to breathe. Izuku barely had time to think that must be who had screamed before he had to dodge out of the way of a torrent of water aimed straight at him. Izuku landed in a roll and grabbed his capture weapon on the way to his feet. He aimed for the drowning employee's ankles and quickly pulled them out of the cloud of water, which thankfully didn't follow her. She gasped for breathe and the other employees hurried to check on her as Izuku reeled in his capture weapon and turned to face the robber. "Who are you supposed to be?" the robber sneered. "Some kind of second-rate sidekick?" Izuku didn't think Eraserhead would announce himself. If so, he wouldn't be such a cryptid, so he didn't dignify the question with a response. Instead, he started analyzing the quirk in front of him. The robber controlled water, that much was obvious, but quirks were more complicated than that. Every quirk had a weakness and those weaknesses could be exploited, just like when he gave the telepath a panic attack. He just had to figure out what this guy's weaknesses were, and then maybe he'd stand a fighting chance. The robber pulled water from a large jug fastened to his hip and pushed the blob through the air at Izuku, forcing him to dodge if he didn't want to risk drowning. The blob followed him as he zigzagged, keeping the robber in view, and Izuku couldn't help taking a moment to admire the man's quirk control. He must have spent years practicing to move the water around with such precision. Izuku shook his head and took a deep breath as he ran. He could admire the quirk's strengths later. Right now he was supposed to be focusing on the weaknesses. The robber carried at least one. Izuku spared a glance at his opponent, no two big jugs of water on him. If he had to carry it, that meant that he couldn't create it or pull water from the air. That meant that what Izuku had to do was bait him into using up all his water. Izuku stopped running and planted his feet, hands tightening around his capture weapon. He whipped it through the air, slashing straight through the water blob. About a third of it rained onto the floor, but the rest simply reformed into a smaller blob and started chasing him again. Okay, maybe forcing him to use all his water wasn't a viable plan after all, especially since he could use the water puddled on the ground too, couldn't he? Izuku thought about it, starting to run out of breath as he kept dodging the water blob. If he could use the water on the floor, then why did he pull fresh water from his jug to attack Izuku? Why not just use the same water he tried to drown the employee with? What was special about the water in the jug that disappeared when it hit the ground? The robber had grabbed fresh water. The water in the jugs was purified. The beginnings of another plan began to turn inside Izuku's head, and for the first time in the fight, he started running down the aisles, out of sight of the robber. The water blob started to fall behind, which was good information but not what Izuku needed right now. He scanned the aisles as he ran. Canned beans, no. Noodles, salt. He used his capture weapon to grab 2 large containers of salt as he skidded around the corner and started back toward the front of the store. The blob had struggled to follow him once he'd left the robber's line of sight, so Izuku glanced behind him. Yep, he'd lost the blob, which meant the robber probably didn't know where he was. Now was the time to see if all his stealth training had paid off or not. He slowed down and took a moment to listen to his footsteps. Once he was as confident as he could be in their silence, he crept out from the aisles and started sneaking toward the robber, who was thankfully turned away from him, focusing on the aisle Izuku had disappeared down. Izuku kept his footsteps silent and snuck up until he was right behind the robber. Breathe carefully, be aware of every movement. The caps on the jugs were open and Izuku readied the salt. Go slow, make every movement intentional. 1 container of salt in each and the robber noticed the change in weight and weird Eraserhead, handed pose to pull fresh water from his jugs, but nothing happened. Izuku breathed a silent sigh of relief. He'd been right. The robber's expression shifted from confused to afraid to angry all in the course of a few seconds. With his quirk rendered useless, he did the only logical thing and charged Izuku, arms outstretched for a sloppy grapple. Izuku sidestepped and flicked out his capture weapon, tangling the fabric around the robber's arm and legs. A couple zip ties later, Izuku was running out the door, texting the police about the robber, not forgetting to mention the traumatized employees that should probably be treated for shock, but Izuku wasn't trained on how to handle that and was afraid of making things worse. The good thing was that the real Eraserhead wasn't known for sticking around either. Tsukachi signed as he looked through the glass of the interrogation room at the robbery suspect. The new number had texted in this one too. He'd forgotten to ask Eraser about his number changing, but as long as this really was Eraserhead's takedown, he'd just save them both some time and update his contacts. One of the officers handed him a file and he glanced through it as he walked into the room. All right, mister, he glanced down at the file. Omizu, we have multiple eyewitness accounts about your attempted robbery this evening, but we'd like to hear your side of the story. The man had a surly expression on his face. I ain't telling you nothing. Tsukachi expected that, but it didn't make it any less troublesome. Can you at least tell me about the hero who apprehended you? Some skinny little kid all in black with some kind of freaky snake scarf thing around his neck. Creepy little twerp. Tsukachi had to hold back a chuckle. Eraser must have just shaved. He had a bit of a baby face without all the stubble. He was not going to tell Eraser about this. He didn't want to die. The twerp made it so I couldn't use my quirk. Omizu muttered. Yeah, this was definitely Eraserhead's capture. Tsukachi asked for a few more details, then went back out into the hall and pulled out his phone. He didn't have time to delete the old number right now, so he just added the new number to the same contact and put his phone back in his pocket. Get back to paperwork. Izuku jumped off the slide and landed in a roll, trying to absorb the impact like he'd read online. Parkour required a lot of practice, but Eraserhead was supposedly a master at it, so Izuku had to be at least decent to avoid giving the hero a bad name. That meant that whenever he wasn't in school, doing homework, or out fighting crime, he was probably at the playground, practicing jumping, climbing, landing, and everything else he needed to know how to do to move like Eraserhead. Even a few weeks ago, he would have become completely consumed by his hobby, letting the world around him disappear before he even realized he'd stopped paying attention to it. Now, however, he was putting in a constant effort to ground himself and pay attention to everything around him, even when most of his focus was on his current task. It had seemed impossible at first, but the more he practiced, the easier it became. Sensory awareness still wasn't second nature, but it was at least habit enough for Izuku to hear Kaken's voice coming toward the park. Instinctively, Izuku froze. What was Kaken going to do to him this time? The punishment was severe enough when Izuku just talked about maybe becoming a hero. Izuku knew what this looked like. Even if this training was just a hobby for him, it wouldn't look that way to Kaken, and if Kaken though Izuku was actually taking steps toward getting into Everschool, even though he wasn't, Izuku wasn't looking forward to whatever Kaken would be willing to do to keep him in his place. But what choices did he have? Kaken was his oldest friend. Izuku had an obligation to stay and talk to him just because of how long they'd been friends. But, well, did friends really treat friends like Kaken treated Izuku? By that logic, if they weren't actually friends, that meant that Izuku had no obligation to interact with Kaken at all. So, what would Eraserhead do? Kaken was a faster runner than he was, even without his explosions propelling him, so it's not like Izuku could run away, but that wasn't the only option, was it? Izuku's mind flashed back to that night in the grocery store, sneaking up on the rubber so silently he didn't even notice. If Izuku could sneak up on someone like that, he could definitely sneak away. Izuku scanned the playground around him. He didn't have time to sneak all the way out of the park, but he could find a hiding spot. His eyes caught on a moderately tall tree with thick foliage. Perfect. The lowest branches of the tree were higher than Izuku could reach, at least without his capture weapon, but Izuku was never without it these days. He'd piled it around his neck while he was practicing parkour so that he'd get used to the extra weight and bulk while he was moving, so it was easy to unwind a bit of the length and toss it up and around the lowest branch. A firm tug tightened the fabric, securing it like a grappling hook, and Izuku grasped the fabric firmly and braced his feet against the tree trunk, pulling himself up hand over hand and walking up the trunk like he was rappelling. His new muscles protested, but Izuku didn't quit until he'd reached the protection of the leaves. He climbed up a few more branches, just to be sure he wouldn't be seen, careful not to rustle the branches more than absolutely necessary. He found a semi-comfortable place on a fork between two branches and settled in right as Kaken and his lackeys arrived at the park. He had more hangers-on than usual, which made Izuku glad he'd hidden instead of trying to talk to Kaken. He couldn't even stand up to the usual 2 or 3 bullies, never mind the 5 or 6 that were surrounding Kaken right now. A thought pushed its way into Izuku's brain saying he'd been able to defeat actual criminals, but Izuku shook it away. That was different. It was like 1 or 2 people at the most, and he had the element of surprise. He'd never been able to beat a bully before, and he highly doubted he could. "You're definitely going to ace the UA entrance exam," one of the lackeys was saying. "With your quirk." The lackey gave a low whistle. "There's no way you could fail." Kaken pushed the lackey away, and Izuku winced at the sound of a small explosion. He knew from experience that had to have stung. "Why are you talking about failure like it's even an option?" Kaken growled. "I've already defeated a real-life villain. I didn't need to be saved. I didn't even want to be saved. I knew I had what it took to take down that stupid villain, and look. Here I am, not a scratch on me. You would be idiotic not to take me." Izuku did a double take. He'd known Kaken had been involved in a villain attack, but Mom didn't tell him that Kaken had saved himself. Kaken was so cool. Izuku could never be like him. But Izuku realized with a start that he didn't want to be like Kaken anymore. He'd found a nice hobby of trying to be like Eraserhead. He gripped his capture weapon tightly. Eraserhead was nothing like Kaken either. Kaken and his lackeys hung around the park for a while longer, sitting and talking on the swings until Izuku's legs started to cramp and he had to forcibly remind himself that Eraserhead had probably handled longer stakeouts. Finally, as the sun began to set, the boys meandered out of the park, still oblivious to Izuku's presence in the tree above them. Izuku couldn't help but feel a small sense of pride. He'd been stealthy and silent enough to hide from a whole group of Kaken's lackeys, not to mention Kaken himself, who, if what he said was true and he'd saved himself from a villain, was on the level of a real-life pro. Izuku made his way to the ground, rappelling down the trunk with his capture weapon the same way he'd gotten up. He shook out the soreness in his legs and made his way home. The next day, instead of going to the playground, Izuku went to his computer. Yesterday, he was proud that he was making good progress toward moving like Eraserhead, but if Izuku really wanted to be like Eraserhead, then the next step in his little hobby was going to be thinking like Eraserhead. Unfortunately, there weren't any interviews with the underground hero to give Izuku a window into his psyche, so he had to rely primarily on second-hand accounts from villains and other heroes who had had run-ins with the hero, which were few and far between. Villains described him as a terrifying entity that could erase their quirks and leave them powerless. Other heroes described him as a creature of logic, devoid of emotion. Izuku was almost certain that couldn't be true. No one was completely emotionless, but it probably was true that he was a highly logical person. That was a start. Something simple that Izuku could emulate. It was probably easier said than done, but since when had Izuku's life ever been easy? As for the villains' view of a monster who could erase their quirks, there wasn't much Izuku could do about that. He would never be able to take away anyone's quirk, but he could use their weaknesses against them, like he had with the telepathy and water villains. Izuku kept searching, scouring the web for any description of Eraserhead that he could find. There wasn't much more about how he acted, but there were a few more descriptions about how he looked. Most stopped at describing the all-black outfit and the capture weapon that no one quite knew what to make of, but there were a couple that went into more detail. One in particular described Eraserhead's intimidating demon stare, and being barely able to see red eyes behind his yellow goggles. Well, Izuku couldn't do anything about red eyes unless he was willing to wear contacts, but if Eraserhead's eyes were barely visible, it probably wasn't worth it. Yellow goggles, however. Night vision goggles would probably be pretty useful and make his hobby a lot easier. He assumed Eraserhead's goggles were night vision, since he couldn't think of any other use the hero would have for goggles. He was too logical to have them just for decoration. The real challenge would be finding a decent, affordable pair in yellow. It was drizzling on Izuku's nightly run around the city, and Izuku was half considering turning around and going back home. Unfortunately, that's not what Eraserhead would do, and Izuku didn't want him to get a reputation as a quitter in case anyone saw. Plus it was good practice testing his parkour skills with less traction than usual. He should probably get better shoes. Some combat boots would probably do the trick. Luckily most of the criminals had decided the rain was too much of a hassle, so Izuku was having a nice, quiet night. He'd mostly been practicing jumping small walls and sticking to the shadows, but he was finally getting to the point where he could jump between short buildings, provided the alleys between them were narrow enough. He just jumped a small alley and was about to make his way down the fire escape when he noticed a couple walking on the street below him. From the way they stumbled, they were obviously intoxicated. Izuku rushed down the fire escape. The heroic thing to do was to offer to escort them home. Izuku barely stopped himself before he stepped out of the shadows of the alley. Sure, that was the heroic thing to do, but it wasn't the Eraserhead thing to do. If Eraserhead offered to walk people home, some of those people would have posted about it and Izuku would have found them during his research. Eraserhead pretty much hated people in general as far as Izuku could tell, so he would never offer to walk someone home, but Izuku still wanted to make sure the couple was safe. He bit his lip, then smiled as an idea occurred to him. He may not be able to walk them home, but that didn't mean he couldn't stalk them home. He'd just follow behind them, keeping to the shadows, and if he was stealthy enough, the couple would never even know he'd been there, but he could easily step in if there was any danger. It was harder than he'd expected to follow the couple without being noticed. He had to follow a full block behind them, and he had to put extra effort into making his footsteps silent so they didn't splash in any of the growing muddy puddles. Plus, there was literally no one else on the street, so if he was seen at all, it'd be obvious that he was following them and he didn't want to scare them, so he had to take care to skirt around the edges of the light from the streetlights and step into the shadows of the alleyways whenever he could. It took so much concentration that Izuku almost didn't notice the figures stepping out from one of the alleys ahead of them. The silhouette was odd, so they must have a mutant-type quirk, but Izuku was too far away to tell what type. He would have loved to believe this person was just walking home, same as the couple, but the way they walked with purpose toward their target made it obvious this wasn't going to be an innocent encounter. Within seconds of spotting the figure, Izuku was running toward the couple, but he was too far back. The figure walked straight up to the couple and spat in each of their faces, which had to be part of their quirk because the couple immediately started screaming and wiping at their eyes trying to get whatever it was off. Okay, so he needed to protect his eyes. With the streetlights, it wasn't quite dark enough to need his new night vision goggles, but Izuku put them on anyway, just in case the villain tried the same trick twice. It had taken a bit of searching to find them in yellow, but eventually Izuku had found a site with decent reviews. He'd had to use the money that he'd set aside for a new All Might figure, but hobbies were expensive. Izuku ran as fast as he could, throwing stealth to the wind as he watched the villain grab a fuse and wallet from the screaming couple and try to make a run for it. They would have succeeded if Izuku hadn't lashed out with his capture weapon and wrapped it around their ankles, sending them slamming into the ground. He probably needed to learn some new tricks, but hey, it worked. The villain cursed and hurried to untangle their legs. Izuku ran forward, reviewing what little he knew of their quirk. It had to do with their spit, and it probably couldn't hurt skin if the villain immediately went for the most vulnerable part of the body. Now that he was closer, Izuku could see that the person had a fish mutant-type quirk, with a fish head, webbed hands, and prominent gills on their neck. Their quirk likely had something to do with water, then. It wasn't a guarantee quirks could be strange like that, but mutations and quirks were often related. The fish villain had managed to get their legs untangled and scrambled to their feet. Then they did something strange. Rather than immediately attacking, they stood with their palms upwards, like they were trying to catch the rain. Izuku stood at the ready, wondering what was coming. After a few long moments, the fish villain turned their head slightly to the side, and all of a sudden, a narrow stream of water came shooting out of the gills on their neck with enough force to cut Izuku's cheek as he sidestepped to try and avoid it. Okay, so they could collect water with their hands and send it shooting out their gills, but what did the spit have to do with it? The villain ran to the gutter and stuck both hands in a puddle, grimacing. Izuku had just seconds to wonder why their expression changed when they straightened up and spat in Izuku's face. He was grateful for his goggles and the fact that his mouth was closed as he received a faceful of dirt and grease. Less than a second later, Izuku's cheese was hit with another water attack just strong enough to knock the wind out of him. He put one hand on his knees for a second and put the other hand on his chest in an attempt to catch his breath. He pulled his hand away and went to wipe the mud away on his pants, only to realize that he hadn't been hit with the muddy water from the puddle, but instead clean water. That meant that the villain was filtering the water. The contaminants went to his mouth and got spat out. No wonder he'd grimaced if he was tasting all that mud, while the clean water exited through the gills. That was so cool. The villain started running away. Geek out about the quirk later. He couldn't let Eraserhead get a reputation for letting villains get away. Izuku lashed out with his capture weapon for the villain's ankles, but they'd learned from the first time Izuku had tried that trick and jumped just in time to avoid tripping. Izuku chased after them, mind racing with the new information. The villain's hands were the most critical part of their quirk, since that seemed to be how they collected water to attack with. If they managed to get their hands on any water, which, since it was raining, was everywhere, Izuku would be at risk for two different attacks, the water from the gills and whatever dirt and toxins that had been in the water that the villain would spit out. So logically, all Izuku had to do was cover their hands. He lashed out with his capture weapon again, this time going for the villain's wrist. The villain had been expecting another tripping attack, so wasn't prepared. They reached over with their other hand to try and untangle the wrist Izuku had grabbed, which put both of their hands in range of Izuku's capture weapon, which he started wrapping around their hands as quickly as he could. They SCKD out the moisture that had managed to soak its way into the fabric, but once Izuku dodged that attack, they kinda just gave up and sat down like they knew they couldn't fight without their quirk. They were wrong, of course. They could still probably beat Izuku with both hands tied in front of them, but Izuku wasn't about to tell them that. He hurried and pulled a grocery sack out of a nearby trash can, then ran over to the villain and covered their hands, untangling his capture weapon so he could retrieve it, then zip-tying the plastic bag around the villain's wrists as they sat there. A few drops of water had to have gotten in the bag during this whole process, but either it wasn't enough for the villain to use or they had truly given up. Izuku sent a quick text to the police and jogged back toward the drunk couple, who were staring at him with awe. Are you alright? Izuku winced at how awkward he sounded. Sorry, of course not, you just got robbed, but did you get your stuff back at least? I think the robber dropped them near the start of the fight. The couple nodded silently. I'm gonna let the police know what happened so they can pick them up and make sure you guys get home safely, okay? The couple just kinda stared at him blankly, and he stood there for a long moment before deciding it would probably be less awkward to just leave. He wished that he had the skill to make some dramatic exit like pulling himself up onto the surrounding buildings with his capture weapon, but with the rain and how drained he was from the fight, he didn't want to risk it. Anyway, he ended up just running into the shadows of the nearest alleyway and onto the neighboring street. He was tired, soaked, and sore, and Izuku suspected that even the real Eraserhead would agree that it was time to go home. Shoyuta was a bit perplexed lately. His fights had been oddly easier than usual. None of the villains he fought were expecting to have their quirks erased. Sure, he always finds plenty of villains who don't expect their quirk to be taken away, but there's always some of the more intelligent, or the more paranoid, ones who had heard of the cryptid that came from the shadows and took away quirks. Shoyuta didn't necessarily do anything to intentionally add to those rumors, but he didn't do anything to lessen them either. He didn't like having a reputation, but it was a part of the hero life, even in the underground. Lately, however, it seemed like his unwanted reputation had thankfully disappeared. The villains were still afraid of him, but didn't believe he could cancel their quirks until their quirks were gone. From there, they were usually shocked enough for Shoyuta to get them restrained, assuming they didn't just give up entirely. It wasn't bad, just strange. The villain he'd just knocked face down on the floor struggled a little bit as Shoyuta put the zip-tie cuffs on him. "I thought the whole canceling quirks thing was just a rumor," he grumbled. "My buddy fought you last month and he didn't get his quirk taken away." Shoyuta scoffed. "Your buddy must have been easy to beat." The villain grumbled something Shoyuta couldn't hear, but was probably highly derogatory anyway, so he decided he didn't care. He sent a text to Tsukachi with the location of the villain and used his capture weapon to pull himself up to the top of the building. Izuku fidgeted with his pencil in class, carefully keeping his muttering silent as he thought. School wasn't actually that bad these days. Ever since he'd had the logical realization that Kaken wasn't actually his friend anymore, he'd been making an effort to avoid him. It was easier than he'd thought to use his stealth training to disappear into an empty hallway or a crowd of people, so Kaken didn't even see Izuku unless it was in class and Izuku sat in the back anyway. Kaken seemed even more confident these days, which made Izuku happy. He supposed it had something to do with beating a real-life villain, which meant the increased confidence was well-deserved. Izuku had moments when he felt the same. After all, he'd beaten villains too, but unlike Kaken, Izuku had to resort to dirty tricks and taking advantage of the villain's quirk's weaknesses to do it. And unlike Kaken, Izuku couldn't brag about it, otherwise Eraserhead wouldn't be able to take the credit. Kaken's crowd of lackeys had grown with his confidence. It seemed like everyone wanted to be friends with the guy who'd taken down a real villain, like it would help them be heroes. Izuku, however, knew it wouldn't. When it came time to fight a villain, it was really only your skills that mattered. Sure, powerful allies helped, not that Izuku would really know, he always fought alone, but in the end, everyone had to rely on their own skills. Relying too much on someone else would just get them killed in a real fight. If only there was a way to teach them that, but there was no way anyone would listen to a quirkless Deku like him. The bell rang and Izuku quickly left the classroom and disappeared into the throngs of people in the hallway. He'd learned his lesson about trying to be the last to leave. Rather than helping him slip out unnoticed, it really just provided an opportunity for him to be cornered. It was only logical to avoid that. Izuku spotted Kaken looking for him, but went the other way. If he got burned today, he wouldn't be able to go out tonight and do his hobby. He slipped out a back door and took the long way home, practicing parkour whenever he could on the way. It was good exercise, and before Izuku knew it, he was tired, sweaty, and, unfortunately, out of water. He turned his water bottle completely upside down and tried to get the last few drops. He wasn't that far from home, but he was still thirsty. "Maybe I can help?" Izuku startled at the voice. So much for situational awareness. There was a girl just a little older than him standing a few feet away, giggling. "Help!" Izuku glanced between her and his empty water bottle. "How?" "My quirk allows me to pull water from the air." The girl smiled. "My name is Aoi. Give me your water bottle." Izuku eagerly handed over the bottle and watched the magic happen. The girl held her hand in a fist over the mouth of his water bottle and, after a few seconds, water started seeping out from between her fingers. "That is such a cool quirk. Does the water come out distilled, like rainwater?" Yeah, actually." The girl gave him a weird look. "I bet it works better in humid environments." Izuku lost himself in his muttering. "Which means it doesn't work as well in dry environments. I bet it'd be useless in a fire." "Ugh." The girl backed away slowly. "Well, you have a good day, I guess?" She turned and hurried away, and Izuku winced. Apparently, his hobby had gotten him in the habit of immediately finding a quirk's weakness, which was admittedly kinda creepy. He made his way home, selfishly kinda hoping that the real Eraserhead wasn't that great with people either. Kaido was led into his cell. His HNDCFFs weren't too tight, but they were still uncomfortable, so it was a relief when the guards took them off, even if it was through the now closed bars of the cell. His cellmate was already in the top bunk and Kaido ignored him as he took his own place on the bottom bunk, laying down and staring at the mattress above him. "So, what did they catch you doing?" His cellmate's voice drifted down from the top bunk. Kaido considered not answering, but figured being rude to his cellmate wasn't a great way to start his incarceration, purse snatching. Tempted, obviously. "And you?" "Robbing a grocery store." His cellmate sighed. "Not my best moment. Hero or police?" "Hero." Kaido grimaced. "A new one too, to make it worse." He looked pretty young. "Mine too." His cellmate growled. "Damn and twerp made it so I couldn't use my quirk, and if that wasn't bad enough, there was that scarf of his." Kaido sat up. "Scarf?" "Yeah, kid had some sort of scarf he used to fight." "That I think we were arrested by the same guy." Kaido said, "Eraserhead?" "Yeah." His cellmate stuck his head down so he could see Kaido. "I'm Omizo." "And you?" "Kaito." Omizo grinned. "Well, Kaido, you seem like a great guy. I've got big plans for when I get out of here. You want in?" It had been a busy night. Shoyuda had already taken down 10 villains and he'd only been out a few hours. Seemed like every villain in the city was out to cause havoc. He'd just finished up with another crime, texting Tsukachi to pick up the villains before he continued his patrol. Shoyuda heard a scream. It sounded like it was a few streets away, so Aizawa used his capture weapon to pull himself onto the nearest rooftop, hardly thinking about the action after a decade of practice. He parkoured across the rooftops, but by the time he neared where he thought the scream had come from, he could see his own breath, despite the fact that it was a mild night 2 streets away. Wonderful, a villain with temperature control. This would be a pain. He looked down from the roof to see a villain pushing a guy against the wall, a knife in one hand. Looked like it was a standard mugging attempt then. Time to get this over with. He dropped down onto the street. As soon as he made his landing, his feet slid out from under him and he fell, bruising his tailbone as he hit the ground. Just wonderful. The thud from his fall had alerted the villain to his presence and they had turned around, still holding the victim against the wall. Shoyuda stared down the villain as he got to his feet, much more carefully this time, and readied his capture weapon, but waited to activate his quirk. It wouldn't do anything against the black ice already on the ground and the villain wasn't attacking. That changed quickly though. The villain extended his hand, the one he was holding the knife with, and now that Shoyuda had a better view, he saw the knife was actually a shard of ice. A few seconds later, multiple thin, sharp shards of ice were launched his way. He dodged, of course, but the black ice covering the street made him lose his footing and he slid far farther than he intended, slamming into a wall with a slight wince. Shoyuda stood up and considered his next move carefully. He could use his caltrip and dig them into his shoes to give him more traction on the ice, but he liked these shoes and it would be illogical to ruin them. So, since the ice covered the entire surface of the street, he'd just have to stay above the surface. He used his capture weapon to pull himself up onto a lamppost and activated his quirk. The villain made a sound of dismay when he realized his quirk wasn't working and Shoyuda grinned. He lashed out with his capture weapon and wrapped it around the villain, then jumped off the lamppost with his weapon still laying over it so he could use the villain as a counterweight to slow his descent. The villain was now suspended a foot in the air and Shoyuda held tight to his capture weapon to help keep his balance. He texted Tsukachi before lowering the villain and zip-tying his wrists, then continued his patrol, a little bruised, but none the worse for wear. It was going to be a long night. Eraserhead was a workaholic and Tsukachi was a little concerned. He'd taken down 25 villains last night, which had to be some sort of record. The paperwork for 10 of those arrests was already in perfect and by the book. That was a weird thing that had been happening lately. Eraser would turn in approximately 1/3 of his paperwork on time and filled out with care, but then apparently got tired or bored or something and filled out the rest of them sloppily and turned them in late. It was better than it used to be when all of Eraser's paperwork was turned in sloppy and late, so Tsukachi guessed he shouldn't look a gift horse in the mouth, But why couldn't the guy do all his paperwork on time? Rin had to hand it to the police. They sure didn't waste any time getting him incarcerated. By 8 hours after his arrest, he was walking into the prison cafeteria for lunch. The slop they were serving didn't look appetizing, but he was hungry enough he didn't care. He went through the line and found an empty table to sit at. He wasn't really interested in making any friends or enemies of those around him, but that didn't mean that others weren't interested in him. 10 minutes after sitting down, he noticed a pair of prisoners coming toward him from the side. He tensed as one sat down on one side of him and the other on the other. It felt odd to be the victim of a shakedown rather than the perpetrator of it. "So, we hear you've got a water quirk." One of the villains, obviously the leader of the pair, said. "I'm Omizo. Nice to meet you." Rin responded instinctively. He didn't want to explain his quirk, but with the way the guys were cornering him, he didn't think he really had a choice. "My quirk is black ice. I can create thin sheets of ice, but only up to a few millimeters thick. Do you have to carry water around you to freeze, or do you pull it from the air?" Omizo asked. "From the air. And is it pure water?" Omizo looked almost crazed now. "No." Rin tensed, afraid of Omizo's response. "It has whatever contaminants were in the air." Omizo deflated, obviously disappointed. "Well, I suppose it can't be helped, but that's still a pretty cool quirk. So how'd you end up here with an awesome quirk like that?" "Eraserhead." Rin said the name like a curse. "DMN hero erased my quirk so I couldn't use my ice. It was unsettling to not be able to access my quirk, I'll tell you that." "Wait, you couldn't even access it?" the other villain asked. "Like he took it away completely, not just made it so you couldn't use it?" "Yeah, at least that's what it felt like." He shivered at the memory. "Why?" "Well, you see, we're just confused because Eraser took us down too, but we didn't get our quirks taken away." Omizu explained. "Kid just made it so we couldn't use them effectively." "Kid?" Rin was confused. "With those eye bags and stubble? He's gotta be at least your age." The two villains looked at each other before the one he didn't know the name of spoke. "No? He's like 15 at the most." "Wait." Omizu held up a hand. "What did he look like?" Rin thought for a minute. Long hair, baggy clothes, combat boots, yellow goggles, and his weird scarf thing. Eye bags and stubble, like I said before, plus he wasn't tall, but he wasn't short, you know. Omizu shook his head. "No. The outfit was the same, yellow goggles, weird scarf and all, but the guy who arrested us had short hair, couldn't have been a full-grown adult yet, and definitely didn't have any stubble. You know what that means, boys." He waited a moment for it to sink in. "There's 2 Eraserheads." "2?" Rin blinked. "How does that even work? I guess the kid must be the older Eraserhead's protege or something." "We got taken down by the apprentice?" The other villain winced. "Ouch. Doesn't matter." Omizu shrugged off the embarrassment. "It's not like we'll run into either of them again. More importantly, we've got some big plans and we want you to be part of them." Omizu gave a sharp grin and Rin gulped. "You in?" Izuku flopped down on his bed, exhausted, but proud. He'd taken down a full 10 villains last night. He'd done the paperwork as soon as he'd gotten home and just barely finished up in time to go to school. Kaken didn't even notice him at all today, which was nice. The stealth training was really paying off. He wasn't anywhere near the real Eraserhead yet, he doubted he ever would be, but he was happier than he'd been since he was 4 and that had to count for something. He smiled and closed his eyes, falling into a dreamless sleep almost immediately. The alarms blared as the 3 villains got as far away from the prison as they could. "Come on," Omizu said. "We've got to get as far away as we can before the heroes get here." Their running got them to the main road fairly quickly and Omizu gave an evil grin. "Rin, go ahead of freeze over the road." "Why?" "So we can stop the next car that passes." Omizu said it like it was obvious. They won't be expecting any black ice this time of year, so they'll slide and be forced to stop. If they don't wreck the car. Kaito pointed out. Omizu shrugged. "In that case, we wait for the next one." Rin nodded and froze the road. Luckily, it didn't take long for the next car to pass. Like Omizu had predicted, They hit the black ice and immediately started to fishtail, managing to regain control of the car only once they hit the shoulder where there wasn't any ice. The driver stopped the car, obviously recovering from the shock, and that was when the villain struck. They surrounded the car and Omizu yanked the driver's side door open. Kaito did the same to the passenger side door and reached toward the cup holder, where there was large soda. He filtered it, the sickly sweet taste of the syrup filling his mouth as he shot water at the driver's arm with enough pressure to leave a bruise. The guy yelled and clutched his injured arm, and Omizu quickly telepathically grabbed the water before it could hit the seat and pick up any impurities. He held the blob of water menacingly in the air only millimeters away from the driver's face. As you can see, we mean business, but we'll let you live if you run. The driver rushed to unbuckle his seatbelt and ducked past Omizu as quickly as he could. Omizu grinned and took his new place in the driver's seat. Kaito buckled into the passenger seat and Rin jumped into the back. They sped away before the nearest heroes had a chance to arrive. So, where are we going now? Rin asked. There was an inmate back at the prison who mentioned that his niece also has a water quirk. Omizu said, we're going to go get ourselves an infinite supply of fresh water. Izuku was browsing a hero forum after school when he came across a new hero video. It wasn't even a major hero thither. The caption asked if anyone knew who the hero was, so they must either be lesser known or new, and those heroes did not get enough attention. Izuku was curious to see if he could tell who the hero was without help, so he didn't open the comments, instead heading straight into the video, analysis notebook open and ready. It was dark, obviously taken at night, and the camera footage was shaky and blurry, but still good enough to see a hero on the shorter side dressed all in black with a capture weapon around his neck, bright yellow goggles the only splash of color on the hero. If Izuku hadn't been impersonating the hero for months, he might not have recognized him based on the outfit alone, but he did. It was Eraserhead. Izuku grinned. This was the perfect opportunity to learn more about the hero. There had to be something that he was missing that would help him become more like Eraserhead, after all. He leaned forward a bit and started analyzing the hero's moves. Interestingly, he moved slower than he had in other videos, and there were times when the capture weapon missed its target entirely. Izuku frowned. That didn't seem like Eraserhead. Sure, he didn't have much information on the hero, but the other videos he'd managed to find had a lot more finesse. Maybe the hero was having a bad day? It wasn't until he saw the villain that Eraserhead was fighting that Izuku realized what was going on. He recognized that villain. It was one of the ones he'd taken down on that busy night a few days ago. It hadn't been an easy fight. The guy had had a speed-based quirk that was hard to get past, but Izuku had managed to get the rhythm of the guy's attacks and use his speed against him by using his own momentum to make sure the villain couldn't avoid the capture weapon. Which meant that the person in the video wasn't Eraserhead at all. It was him. Why were people taking videos of him? It's not like he was a hero, except he was supposed to be. Izuku went to the comments, where most of the people watching incorrectly identified him as Eraserhead. This was seriously embarrassing. It wasn't that bad to have villains mistake him for the hero, but everyone else? Well, it was also kinda nice because it meant that he was successfully impersonating the hero, which meant his plan was working and he wouldn't be caught because no one was looking for him. So, there was that. But the pride was drowned out by the fear that his fighting definitely wasn't up to Eraserhead's usual standard. If people saw this video, and they were obviously watching it, since it had comments, and thought he was Eraserhead, which they did, and thought that Eraserhead wasn't up to par, which he wasn't, then it could damage the hero's reputation. Then again, Eraserhead stayed out of the public eye for a reason, to make sure villains didn't know what he could do. So if there was a video going around with a less-than-stellar performance, maybe that was a good thing because it meant that any villains watching this would underestimate him. What was Izuku even saying? Of course this video wasn't a good thing. He would need to train even harder to make sure that he didn't embarrass Eraserhead again. And he'd need to find some way to avoid the cameras and media. It wouldn't do for more videos to get out, so he'd have to be extra careful to avoid being recorded in the future. Izuku sighed and replayed the video. The recording existed and there was nothing he could do about that. He may as well analyze his weaknesses so he could figure out how to cover them. I was walking home when it happened. A car pulled up beside her and she knew that it was probably just pulling over to park and go into one of the houses on this street, but it was still almost as creepy as that kid who'd started figuring out her quirk's weaknesses as soon as they met. She sped up a little to put some distance between herself and the creepy car, but the creepy car sped up too. That's when she realized the danger she was in and started to run. The car sped up again to match her speed and she was just looking for an alley to duck down when she hit a patch of ice and went sprawling onto the sidewalk. She tried to get back up, only to slip again. She screamed as a jet of pressurized water barely missed her. She needed to fight back somehow. She created all the water her quirk could, which was quite a bit, and shot it at the car. It was a long shot, especially since she'd never trained to shoot her water like that, but if it could just distract the villains long enough for her to get away. The water she'd shot out conglomerated into a blob and started heading back toward her before it even reached the ground. She tried to run, but the ice was still preventing her from getting any traction. A second later, the blob reached her. She barely had enough time to take a deep breath before it completely surrounded her. The blob floated gently toward the car and the door to the back seat opened just in time for the blob to go through it. Suddenly, the blob ruptured and she was deposited none too gently on the back seat, coughing and spluttering as she got her breath back. "Ugh, did you have to get the car all wet?" the villain in the passenger seat said. "What do you care? It's not even your car." The driver responded. A third villain sat beside her in the back seat and he reached across her and closed the door. She screamed again as the car sped off to who knew where. Quito started shooting as soon as he entered the bank, the other three following close behind. "Everyone on the ground now!" Omizu yelled. He had one hand in the air, holding a blob of water menacingly in the air, and the other was holding Aoi to make sure she didn't try to run away. Aoi was making a continuous stream of water that added constantly to the main blob. The people hesitated, some of them looking out the window for a passing hero. Omizu scowled. "Not fast enough. Rin, you're up." Ice shot out from under Rin's feet and covered the floor of the bank. People immediately started slipping and falling onto the ground. Omizu grinned. "Now that's more like it." He strode to the front counter, Aoi in tow. The four of them had come prepared with high-traction shoes capable of holding steady on the ice. The teller was grabbing onto the counter with white knuckles as she attempted to not slip. "Give me everything you've got," Omizu demanded. "Or else." The water blob enveloped the teller's head and she instinctively let go of the counter to claw at the water around her face. A single step sent her sprawling to the floor, leaving her spluttering and coughing when the water blob didn't follow. Omizu grinned widely. "You get the picture?" The teller nodded shakily as she pulled herself back up and opened the register. It didn't take long to empty all the drawers and Kaido grabbed the bags of money. "Come on, now let's get out of here before the heroes arrive." The car they'd stolen was still idling outside and the four hopped inside with their spoils and sped off, freezing the ground behind them so no one could follow. There had been 10 bank robberies in the last 5 days. The group had so far managed to evade both the police and heroes. All of the members of the gang had water quirks, so the newspapers had been calling them the Aqua Bandits. To make matters more complicated, the group had kidnapped a young girl and was forcing her to help in their robberies. The missing person report from her parents said she never came home from school and eyewitness statements from the robberies reported that she seemed to be with the group unwillingly. It was, unfortunately, a textbook case of quirk trafficking. The bank robberies needed to be stopped, but rescuing the kidnapped girl pushed it ahead of any other cases on Tsukachi's list. He was considering calling in Eraserhead to help, not only because of the troublesome quirks, but because he had previously arrested all 3 villains before they escaped prison. Detective Tsukachi? Sasha came up to his desk, for a bit on edge. "There's someone here I think you should see." Tsukachi followed him to the entrance of the police station and had to hide his shock when he saw one of the very villains he'd been thinking about standing there, looking uncomfortable. It was the ice villain, named Rin according to his case file. "Let's take this somewhere more private," Tsukachi offered. He led Rin to an open interrogation room and the two sat across from each other, Rin fidgeting a bit in the uncomfortable chair. Tsukachi had just opened his mouth to ask why the villain was turning himself in when Rin suddenly spoke up. "Okay, look, I was on board when I thought it was just the robberies, but the kidnapping was crossing a line. That little girl doesn't deserve this kind of life, but Omizu will drown me if I just try to take her out of there. I just do what you want with me, but you got to save her. So, you turn yourself in and lead us to their hideout, and in return, you want what? Tsukachi asked. Just the girl's safety? Rin winced a bit. I don't want to ask too much, but if I could get put in a different prison than the other two, he chuckled nervously. I don't want to get shanked, you know? Tsukachi nodded. That sounds reasonable. He reached across the table and shook Rin's hand. I look forward to working with you. So how is this going to work? It's still early in the day. I told them I had some personal stuff to take care of and I'd be back tomorrow morning, but they're gonna know something's up when I don't come back. Then we'll just have to do the raid tonight. Tsukachi said. I've already got a hero in mind to help with it, so I'll call him in and we'll get to work. Which hero? Rin asked. We'll be working with Eraserhead. Tsukachi answered. Okay. Rin nodded. Which one? Tsukachi froze. What? Which Eraserhead? Rin repeated. The one who actually erases your quirk, or the kid who turns your quirk against you? Tsukachi's brain spun. 2 phone numbers. 2 styles of filling out paperwork. 2 Eraserheads. He whispered. He was such an idiot. Did you not know there were 2? Rin asked. I mean, they have such similar fighting styles. We all kinda assumed the kid was the original one's apprentice, but if not. No, I was just confused for a second. It wouldn't do for villains to know that someone had successfully impersonated a pro hero, so instead of screaming and putting his head in his hands like he wanted to do, he forced a smile. Let me get back to you on which Eraserhead you'll be working with. Would you excuse me for a moment? He left the interrogation room as quickly as he could without running. He pulled up his contacts and called the older number he had for Eraser. Thankfully, it was the real Eraserhead that answered. What is it? You woke me up from my post-patrol nap. We have a bit of a problem. So let me get this straight. The Hero Commission president stared at them like disappointing children. There was a vigilante not only operating under your noses, but impersonating a pro-hero for months, and you just didn't notice? Tsukachi and Aizawa stood in her office, feeling very much like they'd just gotten called into the principal's office. Yes, ma'am, Tsukachi muttered. Everyone thought it was the real Eraserhead doing the arrests, so we didn't think to look for a vigilante. The disappointed look grew stronger. Am I really supposed to believe that there were no signs? Well, there were a couple of indiscrepancies, Tsukachi admitted. But nothing outside the realm of possibility. The president sighed. Did you at least notice that the appropriate paperwork wasn't being done? That's the thing, the kid filled out the paperwork. Tsukachi said in exasperation. He created a phishing email to get Eraser's hero password, which he fell for, but he turned to Aizawa. He filled out the paperwork better than you do. That got him a classic Aizawa glare. What do you mean by that? A third of your paperwork is always on time and filled out perfectly, then the rest is sloppy and late. Tsukachi returned Aizawa's glare with one of his own. That's the stuff by the real Eraserhead. The president cut in. And you didn't notice or bring it up, because? Because I thought if I mentioned it, then he'd stop doing any of the paperwork on time. Tsukachi explained. I get on him to improve his paperwork all the time, so I thought he was finally reforming his ways. He shot Aizawa another glare. I should have known he was too much of a stick in the mud. Well, next time, please, just talk to him about it. The president said in frustration. An incident like this could corrode the public's faith in heroes and their competency. You said the villains all believe that the second Eraserhead is the real Eraserhead's apprentice. Tsukachi nodded. They assumed it was kinda like an internship or work study. The president nodded firmly. Then we just make that the truth. Our story is that it's been that way from the beginning. I don't want an apprentice. Aizawa said shortly. You don't have a choice. The president pointed at him. Aizawa sighed. Wouldn't the kid need a provisional license for this whole plan to work? You're in luck. The president said. There's a provisional licensing exam happening this afternoon. It's a bit of a drive from here, but we're going to use the excuse that it was the first available exam. Have you figured out his identity? Yes, it was easy to track the IP address of the phishing email Aizawa received, once we knew what we were looking for. Tsukachi said, Izuku Midoriya, age 14, Quirkless. The president wrinkled her nose. Quirkless? She thought for a moment. Well, Eraserhead stays out of the public eye, so as long as the new Eraserhead does the same, I suppose it won't be an issue. Eraserhead, go pick him up, you'll be escorting him to the testing site. And if he refuses to take the exam? Aizawa asked. Or if he fails? The president leveled them both with a glare. You had better hope he doesn't. For the sake of both your careers. Izuku was just finishing up watching a hero video when he heard a knock at the door. He hurriedly shut his notebook and went to answer it. When he opened the door, saw a man with straggly hair, stubble, and a very familiar scarf. He immediately slammed the door shut. I already saw you, problem child. Eraserhead called through the door. It's illogical to hide at this point. Izuku hesitated, but knew that if Eraserhead knew he existed, he'd manage to find him wherever he went, so there was no point in hiding. He slowly opened the door again. You're Eraserhead, he said dumbly. Eraserhead gave him a look. Apparently, so are you. Izuku winced. Actually, my name is Izuku Midoriya. I know. Eraserhead looked unimpressed. I did do some modicum of research before coming to confront the kid who's been impersonating me for months. Izuku shrunk in on himself. I am so sorry. I swear I didn't mean to start impersonating you. I just found a good-sized piece of your capture weapon and started practicing as a hobby, but then I came across a robbery and... That doesn't really matter at this point. Aizawa cut him off. Go get your uniform on and grab your capture weapon, you're coming with me. Okay, so Eraserhead was arresting him, but wanted him to bring the evidence that he really had been impersonating a pro hero. Looking at it now, it was probably always inevitable that Eraserhead and the police would find out. He didn't know why he'd thought they wouldn't. At this point, being arrested was just the logical consequence of his actions, so he didn't really have any other option than to do what he was told. Izuku got dressed quickly and grabbed his capture weapon, holding it in his hands for a moment and feeling the rough material against his fingers before he slid it around his neck. They were undoubtedly going to confiscate his capture weapon, Eraserhead's capture weapon, which he shouldn't have had to begin with. He was going to miss it. Over the past few months, it had become almost like an extension of his body. It was going to feel like a piece of him was missing. He wiped a couple stray tears from his eyes at the thought, then took a deep breath and went back into the entryway, where Eraserhead was waiting and looking at the family pictures on the walls. I'm ready. Eraserhead nodded and held open the door for Izuku. He led him to a car. Just a car, not a cop car. It must be an undercover vehicle, and Izuku buckled himself into the passenger seat. He was going to prison, that much was obvious, but he couldn't help but wonder why he wasn't in HNDCFFS. The drive to the police station was longer than it should be. Izuku had memorized the locations of all the nearest stations as part of his vigilante work, and he knew they had passed at least 3. Was there a specific police station they were going to? He wanted to ask, but didn't want to annoy Eraserhead, so stayed quiet as they drove. Eraserhead stayed quiet too, eyes on the road. The silence made the drive feel even longer. After what felt like forever, Eraserhead finally turned into a parking lot, but it wasn't a police station. It was a large building that Izuku didn't recognize. All right, problem child. We're here. Izuku looked at the building, then at Eraserhead. Where is here, exactly? We're at the Commission's testing ground for new heroes. Eraser said, You're getting your provisional license today. Izuku felt like he'd been dunked in cold water. He spluttered for a moment. What? You're not arresting me? I never said I was. Eraserhead snorted. Letting you think that was just a logical ruse to get you here. But, Izuku tried to organize his thoughts. But why? Look, kid. Eraser sighed. It's not a good look for the Commission if a 14-year-old is able to impersonate a pro hero for months on end without anyone catching on. It makes them look incompetent. So, since the villains already think you're some kind of hero in training, the most logical course of action is just to run with what they already believe. In reality, there's 2 choices, You can either go in there and get your provisional license and become what everyone already thinks you are, or you can go to juvie. But if you go to juvie, you're gonna be causing a lot more problems for me. Oh no, I couldn't. Izuku shut his mouth. I don't want to cause any problems for you, Eraserhead, at least, not any more than I already have. Izuku's brain finally caught up with the situation and he sat up straight. I'm getting my provisional license. Only if you pass. Eraserhead said. If not, you're going to juvie. No pressure. Shoyuta found a place in the stands to watch the exam. Izuku Midoriya. Age Quirkless. To be honest, Shoyuta wasn't sure what to expect from the kid. He would have preferred to have time to see the kid fight before putting him up for the provisional licensing exam, but they barely got to the testing site in time as it was. Stupid Hero Commission, obsessed with their own image and forcing a kid on him with no warning. It couldn't possibly be the most logical course of action, but Shoyuta knew the commission president wasn't bluffing. There would be severe consequences if he refused. That being said, if the kid had no potential, Shoyuta would just have to deal with those consequences. He wasn't about to put a weak fighter out on the field where they'd just be killed. That would be the height of irrationality, no matter what it cost him personally. He was so caught up in his thoughts he almost didn't hear Miss Joke coming until she was right behind him. I thought you expelled your whole class this year? Shoyuta scowled. You know very well that was a logical ruse. They'll be taking the exam soon enough, just not this time. So, Miss Joke frowned in confusion. If you don't have any students here? No students. Shoyuta said, just a problem child. Oh. Miss Joke teased. Did someone finally catch the great Eraserhead's attention? That remains to be seen. Eraser said, it's my first time seeing him fight, so we'll see if he actually has any potential. Face it. Eraserhead, you're already attached. Miss Joke sat down beside him. You're such a caring guy. Marry me? Not a chance. The exam this year was capture the flag. Each kid had a belt of 3 flags and they had to have 5 to pass. Aizawa kept an eye out for the problem child, but had only managed to catch a few glimpses of him. His stealth definitely wasn't perfect, but it would probably be worth improving. He kept to the most dimly lit parts of the arena and used the environment to his advantage to keep himself hidden. Staying out of sight wouldn't be good enough, however. He also had to steal a few flags. Shoyuta watched as the problem child stalked another student that had decided to go off alone. He stayed out of sight until the student's back was turned, then dropped down from his cover and attacked immediately. No hesitation, that was good. He did fairly well against the other student, managing to navigate around their quirk with little issue. He must have been watching to see how they used it before confronting them. As soon as he had an opening, the problem child wrapped the capture weapon around his opponent and stole a singular flag, then disengaged and ran back into the shadows. He's like a little mini-you eraser. Miss Joke cooed. That's so adorable. Shoyuta rolled his eyes and ignored her. Midoriya's technique with the capture weapon could use a little work. He was obviously self-taught, but then again so was Shoyuta. That was the problem with a unique weapon. The kid had only had a few months to master it so far, so hopefully he hadn't formed too many bad habits yet. He watched as the kid picked out another target and went after them. He tended to go for the ones that were alone, which on the one hand was only logical, but on the other hand could show a weakness against groups. No good hero was a one-trick pony, after all. They'd have to work on that. Shoyuta groaned inwardly. When had he started thinking like a mentor? He didn't want a protege, but here he was, thinking about how to improve the problem child's combat ability. Midoriya tied up his current opponent and got the final flag he needed to pass the first round, and Shoyuta had to admit it, however begrudgingly. The kid had potential. Izuku couldn't believe he'd just passed. Sure, it was only the first round, but he'd passed. He hadn't made Eraserhead look bad. He didn't know what the second round was going to be, but he was going to pass it, no matter what it took. Eraserhead had implied that the hero would get in trouble if Izuku had to go to juvie, so passing was his only option. Okay. The tired man from the Hero Commission muttered into the microphone. Next round will be a rescue mission. Izuku flinched as a round of explosions sounded around them. There are members of the Help Us company acting as victims. Your job is to rescue them and offer any first-line medical treatment necessary until the police and ambulances arrive. Go. Izuku ran toward the nearest disaster zone. What could he do? He'd mostly focused on taking down villains, but he'd been obsessed with rescue missions since he first saw that video of All Might saving people with a smile. But that wasn't him. He wasn't All Might and he wasn't trying to be. He was trying to be like Eraserhead, who, based on both his reputation and his attitude in the car, would be more likely to save people with a scowl than a smile. So what would Eraserhead do in this situation? Well, he'd do what was most logical. Izuku could leave the bigger rescues to those with stronger quirks, but he was small, agile, and had his capture weapon, so he could fit into small spaces others couldn't. Izuku nodded to himself and started looking between the rubble to see if there was anyone he could help. The problem child was doing well. He'd focused on smaller rescues, using his capture weapon to lower himself into crevasses and retrieve the victims trapped there. He needed a bit more upper body strength. There were a few times that he struggled to lift his victims, so Shoyuta made a mental note to add it to their training regimen. Since the kid wanted to be like Eraserhead, he'd have to train like Eraserhead too. At some point, Midoriya had run out of people that he could effectively save and had made the logical decision to switch to first aid. He knew his way around the provided first aid kits well, maybe too well. Had he studied them like he'd studied how to do paperwork? Or had he had some reason to need them in the past? It was worth looking into. But our kid's doing so well, Miss Joke said. I don't have a kid, and if I did, it wouldn't be with you. Shoyuta said tiredly. Don't you have your own students to watch? I can multitask. Miss Joke shrugged. Midoriya finished patching up the last of the victims and the whistle blew to indicate the end of the exam. Get back to your students. Aizawa ordered as he stood. I've got to go deal with the problem child. Izuku had just gotten his provisional license card when Eraserhead found him. He read over the information about a dozen times in confusion. Eraserhead sighed. Normally, you would have filled out the paperwork yourself, but there wasn't time, so a representative of the Hero Commission filled it out for you. Izuku nodded, still confused. Under hero name, is it really okay for me to be called Erazerhead? It's only one letter off from you. Eraserhead looked down at the license. Each hero technically has to have a unique name, hence the letter change, but from what I can guess, the Commission intended it to be a logical ruse. If there's two Eraserheads with different skill sets, but all the villains know is that they're fighting Eraserhead, that confusion can only give us an advantage. That, and everyone already thinks your name is Eraserhead, and this whole plan hinges on you becoming what they already think you are. Oh. Izuku said. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Good. Eraserhead said. Now let's go. Izuku didn't follow immediately. He was too busy looking at his provisional hero's license. His license. He'd actually done it. He'd done what everyone said was impossible. And it was all thanks to Eraserhead. Eraserhead? He got a slight nod in return, which he took as permission to continue. Thank you so much. Izuku felt tears prickle at the sides of his eyes and bowed. If I hadn't found your capture scarf that day, I never would have made it here and I'd still think I couldn't be a hero and… Geez, kid, take a breath. Eraserhead rolled his eyes. And I didn't do anything. Sure, I cut off a piece of my capture weapon, but I do that all the time and it's never resulted in a kid impersonating me before. You're the one who put in the training to learn how to use the darn thing, so that little card in your hands. He jerked his thumb toward the license. That was all you. Izuku couldn't hold back the waterworks. Inko paced around Detective Tsukachi's desk for probably the 100th time that afternoon. The detective had come to her work and asked to speak with her before proceeding to tell her that her baby had been acting a vigilante and impersonating a pro-hero. She'd apologized profusely for his behavior, of course, and almost hadn't let Tsukachi cut in and tell her they wanted to make Izuku into a legitimate hero. If she hadn't already have been crying, she would have burst into tears. They'd asked her to sign a form giving Izuku permission to take the provisional hero licensing exam. On the one hand, it was such a dangerous career. Reading over the form, there was even the possibility of injury in the exam. She could just not sign and Izuku would be safe, but on the other hand, this was the opportunity that her baby had been waiting for since before he turned 4 and the world came crashing down around his ears. Then, all she could do was apologize, but now she had the power to make that dream a reality just by signing her name. How could she say no? So now, she was waiting with Detective Tsukachi for Izuku and a hero named Eraserhead to come back from the exam. Would her baby pass? Could he pass? Without a quirk, but he'd apparently been fighting real villains for months, so he'd be okay. The worry hit her again as she remembered Izuku's vigilantism. He must have been in so much danger so many times. There might be no point in worrying about something that was already in the past, but she couldn't help it. Just thinking of her baby being in trouble made her anxious. Detective Tsukachi stood up suddenly, looking toward the door, and Inko followed his gaze to see Izuku and a man she didn't recognize walking in, both dressed exactly alike. She ran to meet them. "Izuku! Mom!" Izuku instinctively opened his arms for a hug as she crashed into him and squeezed him tight. "What are you doing here? We needed your mother's permission for you to take the provisional licensing exam." The man, who must be Eraserhead, explained. "On now, problem child, we need to get you ready for your first official mission." "Wait, mission?" Izuku looked surprised. "When I saw we were at the police station, I thought the licensing exam had been a logical ruse and I actually was being arrested." Tsukachi laughed as Eraserhead scowled. "That does sound like something Eraser would do, but no. That provisional license you got is the real deal." Izuku fished it out of his pocket to look at it, then turned to Inko, holding it up for her to see. "Mom, look. I passed. I got my provisional license. I'm so proud of you, baby." Tears welled up in her eyes. "My little hero. Okay, you can have touching family moments tomorrow." Eraserhead said dryly. "For now, you need to focus on tonight's mission." "Tonight?" Inko's worry came back in full force. "Shouldn't he have a little more time to?" "I watched the exam." Eraserhead cut her off. "Your son is a capable fighter. Plus, he'll be with a pro hero and the police. We'll take care of him." Inko hesitated a moment, then nodded. "You should already be familiar with the villains we're taking down, considering that, according to the paperwork, you're the one who arrested them." Tsukachi said. "But there's a kidnapping victim that makes things more complicated. We have a villain who's helping us as part of a plea deal, but the real Eraserhead took him down, so this will be your first time seeing him. He's part of the group that's been doing the bank robberies recently, and he has an ice quirk." "An ice quirk?" Izuku asked, then trailed off into a mutter storm. "Ice quirks are fairly common, but the weaknesses vary. Is he immune to his own ice, or could he be taken down via hypothermia? I was wondering how you managed to make it so the villains couldn't use their quirks." Tsukachi looked impressed. "That's some talent, kid." "Oh." Izuku blushed and ducked his head. "Most people just think it's creepy." "Nothing wrong with being creepy, problem child." Eraserhead said. "Now come on, people who waste time don't deserve to be heroes." "Yes, sir," Izuku said, falling into step behind Eraserhead as he led them toward an interrogation room, forcing Tsukachi to run to catch up. Inko watched them leave and gave a wet smile. Her baby was going to be a hero. Tsukachi led the other two into the interrogation room. Rin sat up a little straighter at the sight of the heroes. That was going to take some getting used to. Tsukachi gestured to them. "This is Eraserhead and his protege, Erazerhead." "Oh, thank goodness," Rin said. "I was a little worried earlier when you didn't seem to know about the second Eraserhead, but I'm glad I was wrong. I recognize you from my arrest, older Eraserhead." Eraserhead just nodded. "We're easy to get confused, so it's only logical to use that confusion to our advantage. It was the kid who took your buddies down, so if they see him, they likely won't be expecting me to come and actually erase their quirks. For that reason, we'll be having the younger Erazerhead enter first." Midoriya sat up a little straighter. "Are you sure it's a good idea for me to go first?" "I'm less experienced and," he trailed off. "Yes, but they'll recognize you, and my quirk works best when I can stay out of sight." Eraserhead explained. "I don't like the idea of sending a kid in alone, though, so I'll be there, just in the shadows so I can erase Omizu's water telepathy quirk when he inevitably starts trying to drown people. You can prevent him by using salt or something to corrupt his water. Izuku said, "That's how I defeated him the first time." "That would work if they hadn't kidnapped Aoi." Rin said, "They use her to create an unlimited supply of fresh water. There must be some weakness to her quirk." Midoriya muttered, "But it's still a good idea to bring along salt, just in case." Tsukachi nodded. "If that's what you need, there's some in the break room." Midoriya looked up. "That would be perfect. What's the other guy's quirk again?" "He can take water in through his hands, filter it, and shoot it out his gills." Midoriya finished. "It was raining when I fought him. If we can somehow manage to dry out his hands, he doesn't think he can fight without his quirk. He just kinda gave up when I fought him before." Good observations. Eraserhead sounded almost proud. "It'll probably be best for me to deal with him, then, since erasing his quirk will be easier than limiting his access to water in this particular fight, at least until we rescue Aoi." They strategized for a few minutes longer before Rin cleared his throat. "So, the warehouse we've been using is a little ways away, so we should probably head out soon." Tsukachi nodded. "I'll gather the police who'll be assisting then. Let's head out." Izuku and Eraserhead followed Rin through the dark warehouse district silently. Rin was apparently freaked out by how quiet they were and kept looking behind him to make sure they were still there. The police were already setting up a line around the general area just in case any of the villains escaped, but Izuku was determined that that wasn't going to happen. If that happened, it would make Eraserhead look bad. Or would it? The police knew the two were different people now. Izuku's actions no longer just reflected upon Eraserhead, they reflected on himself. Izuku wasn't quite sure how to feel about that. He'd somehow assumed that if his actions affected his own reputation, then it wouldn't be as much pressure as trying to live up to another hero's legacy, but it was actually more pressure, because now he was representing both himself and Eraserhead, since everyone assumed he was his protege. It was weird. Izuku couldn't help being a little excited, though, even with the anxiety. It was his first official mission as a real hero. He wasn't just faking being Eraserhead anymore, he was Erazerhead. Eraserhead seemed to pick up that something was up with his emotions, because he put a heavy hand on Izuku's shoulder. "Look, I get being nervous," he said gruffly. "A real mission is a big deal, bigger than the purse snatchings and such that you've been dealing with, and you're still weak against groups, but that's why we're going in together, to cover each other's weaknesses. I don't expect you to be as strong as I am, that would be illogical, but I've seen you fight and know you have potential. That'll be good enough for tonight." Izuku nodded along, letting the words wash over him. Eraserhead thought he could do this, so he couldn't disappoint him. He was going to give it his all and then some. They arrived at a rundown warehouse and Rin stopped. "This is it." Eraserhead grabbed his capture weapon. "Good. You go rendezvous with the police, Erazerhead, and I will take care of this." Rin nodded gratefully and ran away as fast as he could. Izuku turned to Eraserhead, keeping his voice low. "So what now?" Eraserhead jerked a thumb upwards and Izuku followed the action to see a window. He grimaced. "I'm not sure I'm strong enough to get all the way up there with just my capture weapon. Plus, my capture weapon is shorter than yours." "I know," Eraserhead said. "That's why you'll be entering through the front door. I'll be going in through the window. Wait for me to get up there before going in. I'll stay in the shadows until you need me. If it was logical, I'd wish you luck, but you can't rely on that in hero work. It's your skills that count." Eraserhead didn't wait for him to respond before throwing his capture weapon and catching it on the window and pulling himself up. Izuku waited until he had crawled through before running around the building to the front door. He took a deep breath to steady himself, then pushed open the door. "Rin? I thought you weren't gonna be back until tomorrow." One of the villains, Omizu, turned around, then stood up, knocking his chair to the ground when he saw Izuku. "You're that punk who arrested us." Izuku glanced around the room to get an idea of what he was walking into. Omizu had fallen into a fighting stance, as had the other villain, Kaito. The kidnapped girl, Aoi, was huddled in the corner, staring at him with a mixture of fear and hope. Izuku was surprised when he recognized her. She was the girl he'd creeped out when she'd filled up his water bottle. Aoi. Omizu barked. Give us some water. Aoi hesitated for a moment. Izuku understood. The heroes were here now. If she helped the villains, that would be decreasing her chances of being rescued. You know what'll happen to your family if you refuse. Omizu growled. Water. Now. She shrunk in on herself and water started flowing out of her hands. Omizu immediately grabbed it with his telepathy and started creating a blob above his own head. Izuku stuck his hands in his pockets. It wasn't the most practical to fill his pockets with salt, but the full container had been too big to fit. He needed to get some sort of utility belt. Now that he was a real hero, he might even be able to get something from a real support company. He focused his attention back to the fight. That was a problem for later. For now he needed to prioritize the rescue. He ran over to Aoi, grabbing 2 small handfuls of salt and reaching out to grab her hands, rubbing the salt all over them. Immediately, her new water started falling to the floor instead of rising up to join the blob. Sorry, Izuku said. I know you're not here willingly, but I still have to disable your quirk so they won't use it. Aoi stared at him with wide eyes. You're that boy. You dumb brat. Omizu growled and Izuku barely had time to take a deep breath before the water blob engulfed his head. Izuku stuck his hands back into his pockets and grabbed more salt, then clawed at his face to contaminate the water. It didn't take long, thankfully, and the blob dissipated, soaking through Izuku's clothes as it fell to the floor. Kaito! Omizu ordered. Shoot him. Izuku grabbed Aoi and rolled out of the way of a volley of shots that never came. Kaito sounded panicked. I can't use my quirk. Izuku grinned as the real Eraserhead dropped down from the rafters and joined the fight. He really was so cool. The few videos Izuku had been able to find online hadn't done any justice to his fighting style. He was managing to keep both villains in his sights and using his capture weapon to keep both from getting too close. Izuku itched to take notes and he forcibly had to remind himself that he was one of the fighters now, not just a fanboy. He could freak out over Eraserhead's fighting skill later. He grabbed another handful of salt from his pockets and turned to Aoi. Hold this. She obediently held out her hands and he dumped the salt in. Okay? The salt keeps Omizu from being able to use the water you produce. Izuku explained, then grabbed her by the wrist and put his other hand on his capture weapon. He kept along the periphery of the room and kept half an eye on Eraserhead as he led Aoi to the entrance of the warehouse. Eraserhead was doing well, but he needed to get Aoi to safety so he could help. The police were right outside when Izuku burst out of the warehouse with Aoi in tow. He handed her off to Detective Tsukachi. I'm gonna go help Eraserhead. Tsukachi called something after him, but Izuku was already running back into the warehouse. The villains were both distracted, so Izuku lashed out at Kaito with his capture weapon, wrapping him up and trapping his hands against his body. He saw Eraserhead grin and soon enough the real hero's capture weapon was wrapped around Omizu. Good work, problem child. Eraserhead nodded at him. Now let's get these villains into custody. The classroom was so loud that Izuku could hear the chaos from the hall. Izuku looked down at Eraserhead, who had bundled himself inside his bright yellow sleeping bag, ready to test their class with his first logical ruse. Izuku, however, couldn't call himself Eraserhead if he didn't have a few tricks of his own up his sleeve. He couldn't give the hero a bad reputation, after all. Izuku strode into the classroom in full hero gear, which was basically just a miniature version of the real Eraserhead's costume. A few students hardly paid him any mind as he walked toward the front of the room, others gave him weird looks, eyeing his outfit suspiciously. Kaken, however, made sure he was the center of attention. Deku? The rage in Kaken's eyes was so bright it could have given his explosions a run for their money. What the F is a weakling like you doing here? I'm Erazerhead. Izuku said innocently. I'm your teacher, Kaken. The class stopped their conversations and stared at him before one of them, a kid with blonde hair and a lighting strike, spoke up. You're Eraserhead? Yep. Izuku smiled slyly. One of them at least. Problem child, get in your seat. The real Eraserhead's voice sounded by the door and all the students jumped when they saw the yellow sleeping bag and the man inside. I'm Eraserhead. None of you noticed me. I'll give you a pass this time because Midoriya was distracting you, but remember that distractions happen all the time in hero work and that's not an excuse to be unobservant. He shimmied out of his sleeping bag and Izuku grinned as he took out a gym uniform and tossed it to the nearest student. Get dressed. We're doing a quirk assessment first thing. A girl with pink cheeks and short hair raised her hand. Aren't we going to the opening ceremonies? It's illogical to waste time on pointless ceremonies. Eraserhead said bluntly. Now let's go. That still doesn't explain what Deku's doing here. Kaken said. Are you pretending to be some kind of hero? I am some kind of hero, Kaken. Izuku said. I'm Erazerhead. The pink-cheeked girl looked between Izuku and Eraserhead in confusion, but I thought he was Eraserhead. Izuku nodded agreeably. Oh, he is. Midoriya is a student, just like the rest of you. Eraserhead said. Maybe not exactly like the rest of you, he already has his provisional license due to mentoring with a hero, but the classes will still be the same. You're lying. How the hell would he have his provisional license? Kaken let off a couple explosions in his palms. He's just a quirkless weakling. The class went quiet at the news of Izuku's quirk, but Izuku just smiled. I may be quirkless, Kaken, but I'm not a weakling anymore. I'm not just pretending, I am a hero. Not bad for a little hobby.